exploration in a video game's world can be incomparably immersive, an atmosphere unrivaled by other mediums in which the viewer could only ever do just that: view the world. It's a game's interactivity intertwined with its world's detailed maps, array of sounds, characters' expressions that all make them a cut above the rest in immersion. Perhaps this is a reason why so many games aim to have realistic graphics and realistically animated expressions. Maybe it's to achieve that unparalleled immersion a player can get where they can't from a movie or show. Despite this form of realism, there may be another kind that players can enjoy without even knowing it. One that some key people at Nintendo know how to tap into. After all, in the midst of portraying realistic graphics year in, year out, why would a modern Zelda game with vast open fields use a cel-shaded art style if it wished to immerse players? In the midst of all their Zelda titles, it only takes one shining example to answer this question. Before that shining example, however, released numerous Zelda titles, largely to acclaim with their own vast fields to explore and engross the player. Alongside revising this exploration would also allow the team's desire to improve upon Ocarina of Time's gameplay to surface. In the meantime, a realistic-looking Zelda demo would excite audiences across the world. After 2.5 years of pouring their hearts and souls into the embetterment of this new Zelda title, however, little did the team know that one of their sources of pride, the game's art style change, could have proven to be the game's own death knell. Despite the game's innovations and refined gameplay, many were disappointed at the game's visuals as they thought it too childlike. After all, why play a cartoon-looking game when you can play so many other games trending towards realism? Despite this conundrum, the developers would argue that there's a certain kind of reality found in the game where others may fail to achieve. To show one of gaming's best examples of realism underneath an unrealistic aesthetic, you don't want to miss this 20th anniversary retrospective in light of the atmosphere found in The Wind Waker.
たくさん書いたんですけど、でディレクターに見せてどうですかどうですかってこれをまた戻されてっていうのを繰り返してました。何度かのそのリテイクを乗り越えながらやっと OK が出たスケッチっていうのがこちらです。
As many Zelda fans know, Ocarina of Time was a massive success for Nintendo. This may be because, as the Zelda series' director puts it, they make their games very carefully with detail and make sure they're thorough. Ocarina of Time became so large, in fact, that it was quadrupled the cartridge size of Super Mario 64 at 32 megabytes. Series director Eiji Aonuma states they spend much time analyzing their games nearly to their detriment, and more recently thinks there's a need to make decisions quickly, weigh the risks, and see what pays off. After Ocarina of Time's release, however, the team would spend a large amount of time making the next generation's first Zelda title. Aware of this console before Majora's Mask was even completed, the team ran experiments on its hardware. This console would be unveiled to people as the GameCube at Nintendo's trade show, Space World 2000. A realistic-looking demo would subsequently be made from the team's experimentation and shown off at Space World, exciting fans across the globe. It was such an enticing showcase it excited many into the prospect of a more realistic Zelda game for upcoming hardware. Even IGN's staff considered it to be an unofficial sequel in the franchise despite being told the presentation was thrown together at the last minute. Aonuma disliked the demo, as it wasn't what he imagined Zelda to be, as it didn't contain any surprises and looked too much like a simple continuation of previous games. He would be the director for the upcoming Zelda title to be released on GameCube, and Shigeru Miyamoto, one of the most famous figures seen in gaming, would be a producer. Miyamoto would be largely inactive until later, though would approve the game's early direction and give more fine-tuned input later on to ensure quality. Still very early on, Aonuma would work on Zelda's gameplay since Ocarina of Time's release, and the team wanted to improve upon this for Zelda's first GameCube game. He wanted to give it a new feel and make it easier for players to control Link. Adding new complex items would raise a barrier for new players despite keeping the game fresh. Miyamoto worried that keeping many items from previous games would make the game feel too old, but they decided to do so anyway and instead focus efforts to improve Zelda's core challenges that it presents to the players. This concept seems key to Aonuma as he speaks of Zelda games starting off with the team developing a framework for the game. Afterwards, they would then focus their efforts on what they want from the game before developing the story. The reasoning he gives for this is because if one starts with a story to turn into a game, you end up with unnatural parts due to being unable to express in-game content the way the team would want to do from the start. And for this game, they wanted to express something that had never been done before in the series. Wanting to introduce a new style of movement, the team had Link sail a boat in the ocean traveling between islands. So then, they thought to make Hyrule a place flooded down below, then questioned how one would get to Hyrule if it were in the ocean. They decided early on with little hesitation to set the game in the seas, as they liked how they could design the world's mechanics around it and thought showing the sea in this visual style they chose would be interesting. Rather than having something like Hyrule Field, they seemed proud to have the vast ocean serve as a player's hub and world. The team would quickly have ideas flowing for islands, people inhabiting abroad, and deciding what they would be. When speaking of how players would traverse these islands, conversation naturally steered towards the sailboat. Having never built a boat before, Aonuma consulted numerous materials for reference and found what defined a sailboat was its inability to move against the wind. In other seacraft, he says you can sail against the wind if zigzagging, and in response to his descriptions, Miyamoto continually responded to him saying, "It sounds like you want to use a sailboat, right?" Whether it's due to allowing the player to have more agency than other seacraft or otherwise, the team needed to put forth their best efforts to best design its movement, as it would be difficult for the player to control if it were too realistic. Alongside this traversal, they wanted the boat to be akin to a cool toy. As Aonuma puts it, what's the point of sailing if it isn't fun? They wanted to give the player all kinds of interesting things to do with it and came up with numerous ideas, but due to their unfortunately tight deadline only ended up giving it a cannon and a salvage arm. In exploring the ocean, they wanted to ensure the open world would contain no transitions and had to decide how large islands should be. Technical issues arose as they tried to make the boat faster due to thinking it was boring to travel in the boat. At one point, they made it so fast even sharks couldn't keep up. Each island's data wouldn't have enough time to load if they didn't have enough ocean space between different islands, however, so the boat would often just stop. Ultimately, they needed to find a good balance between distances and the speed of the boat. They also didn't add more islands into the game due to hardware limitations as well. Afterwards, they took existing items and applied them to be used on the boat, thinking it could keep the game fresh for players already experienced with said items. The Wind Waker became particularly special to Aonuma as its development coincided with his son's birth. Being the first game he created as a father, he would create a parental figure in the King of Red Lions, the prominent sailboat character in the game who he imagines with a fatherly voice. He wrote his dialogue and had him speak in a self-important manner, in ways that children would understand. Despite this, he more recently became embarrassed when looking back at his perceived image of a father, and his son thought that the character was too preachy upon playing it for the first time. When working on the HD version many years later, dialogue for him would become more mild-mannered. Despite this, the timing of the original game in conjunction with his son's birth is an event he always remembers, and those feelings came back to him for HD. He still holds a special kind of love for the game. After the sea, the wind was next. They wanted to express wind in games for a long time, and despite having windy stages in prior Super Mario games, they think GameCube technology allowed them to truly represent wind blowing in-game. For the Wind Waker, a veteran programmer for environments in previous titles thought to include white lines to visually represent wind. Despite him apparently messing around, the team thought it was a great idea despite its simplicity and decided to use it. Understanding it could be annoying if used too much, they tried to find a good balance, though Aonuma also thinks it looked great when the wind goes flying off. As silly as it may sound, it makes it feel as though the wind's blowing better. Knowing they wanted the sailboat to react to wind appropriately, they decided to implement a system to control the wind. To do this, they decided to use an instrument the player would use, so Aonuma wanted to include a more obscure instrument called the theremin. Despite its obscurity and strange qualities, Aonuma wanted to be able to play music by moving his body similarly to what's required for a theremin, though wasn't specific about how this would be achieved. In response, a Nintendo interviewer joked, saying the game could have been called the Wind Theremin instead. After coming up with the baton that could be expressed as waving like the wind, they couldn't decide which to keep and considered integrating both. For Aonuma, a movie using the theremin released around this time in planning, so they thought it would be interesting to use it for the Wind Waker soon after. They would deliberate until about halfway into development before deciding to scrap the theremin despite their interest. They couldn't really justify incorporating it into the story as it's not a common instrument, so they went with the safer choice of using the baton. Koji Kondo put Link's baton in his left hand to conduct music because of Link being left-handed, but spoke with a different composer after the game's release and was informed that apparently, even in the real world, left-handed conductors hold the baton in their right hand. After implementing it as the game's Wind Waker, they wondered if players would find it difficult to use, likely due to requiring the player to hold inputs and wait, as opposed to previous games allowing the player to input whenever they'd like. While previous games had easier systems to use, the Wind Waker's performances were more musically consistent. Miyamoto reassured the team this was the correct direction to take. Despite the final game's intuitive system, Aonuma still would have liked to see if they could have made it even easier to use, as it can be somewhat difficult to align the movements with sound. Earlier in development, the team discussed including a character to guide the player similar to Navi in Ocarina of Time. Thinking of characters to do this, they thought of using a cat, and at one point even an acorn with a face. This unused model is found in the game's files. While pure speculation, maybe he would have been the face or a placeholder for said acorn. Eventually, the team decided on a frog riding a cloud. After deciding to use two characters to control the wind, however, their ideas changed so the one frog would become two, Zethos and Cyclos. Zethos would serve as a wise and kind god of winds whose headstone would teach the player how to control the wind, where Cyclos would contrast by wreaking havoc amongst those he encounters by using his cyclones, and the player would eventually learn a fast travel song from him using cyclones. Though making this game world had its own set of challenges, utilizing a versatile and fun sailboat in conjunction with the player attaining some controls over the wind would prove to be inventive and practical solutions not commonly seen elsewhere. Clearly, the Wind Waker's unique open sea allowed the game to stand out from both its contemporaries and the franchise's predecessors. While the game development would still be a long journey ahead, by and large, things were coming along swimmingly. As many intriguing developmental decisions as were made, however, one of the game's most standout features would serve as both a boon and a curse for the team.
ディレクターの青沼から、海を舞台にした冒険活劇っていうことと、主人公は元気な少年っていうテーマが聞いていました。そうすると、一番大事なのは動かしていて気持ちいいとか、見ているだけでも気持ちいいといったようなテーマだろうなと考えています。
Though Wind Waker's originally proposed look was different from what we see in-game, this was most likely extremely early on in development, however, as there doesn't appear to be any concept art showcasing the game in a non-cartoony art style. Though likely still planning to express cartoon aesthetics, there would be early sketchwork showcasing Link being at multiple ages. There would be speculation online suggesting that Link was originally planned to slowly grow old in the game as a result of these. If this was initially planned, it's unknown precisely why the idea was scrapped, but it likely would have to do with how challenging it would be to make numerous designs of at least a few characters. When deciding the art style, two of the art designers wondered whether continuing Ocarina of Time's graphical style would be the right decision, as they found it difficult to continue expanding and coming up with ideas for an already thoroughly explored world. With core staff largely comprised of the same people, the team hit their creative limits and thought it wasn't quite right to continue in a more realistic direction. At some point, one of the art designers drew up a toon version of Link. Seeing this unique style of Link quickly aroused ideas in the team for enemy, gameplay, and combat offerings. Inspired by the visuals for Toon Link and Moblin enemies, creative concepts and ideas would be quickly formed. Then, gameplay and animations developed rapidly. Did You Know Gaming, claiming to have translated multiple Nintendo Dream magazines for interviews, states that Miyamoto thought the Wind Waker wouldn't sell upon seeing its art style, questioning how it's even Zelda and had difficulties letting go of the more realistic art style until the end. When the team put this art into the game, they used 3D graphics program Maya for modeling, texturing, and animation. It replaced multiple of their previous 3D processes, helping standardize development. This allowed them to easily move resources from one part of the project to another that saved time and reduced bottlenecks. They were also able to focus more time and effort developing gameplay rather than tweaking art, and Maya was flexible enough to be adapted to the 2D graphics found in the game. According to Miyamoto, one of the reasons they went with a toon style for Link was to bring out his character, as the style allows him to show more emotion. He says they never intended to create a shockwave within the game's art style, and simply wanted to make something new. Aonuma says they weren't inspired by anything specific, rather they were broadly inspired, with much of the team having read manga and watched anime growing up. Miyamoto says if one wanted to base the game's art style off of someone's particular style, they likely wouldn't let them do so. They wanted to take things people have seen, then do something new with it. He thinks this is when you're truly able to do something revolutionary within said medium. From these philosophies, they spent much effort to give the Wind Waker as much of a cartoon look and feel as possible. They would first show off the Wind Waker at Nintendo's Space World 2001, and according to Kotaku, fans felt betrayed as a result of them showing off a more realistic-looking Zelda demo the year prior. In reference to its cel-shaded graphics, many would even negatively refer to the Wind Waker as Zelda. Some press questioned whether Nintendo was aiming Zelda more to children as a new strategy. Miyamoto says that Nintendo's strategy wasn't to cater to kids, but rather to make creative games that can appeal to a broad audience, making it entertaining for everyone. He thinks Nintendo's reputation for being childish during this time is brought on from competitors for their own PR purposes. Despite this, he insists they have always focused on attaining a library that appeals to all ages, young and old. As one response to the Wind Waker's art style's negative reception, Miyamoto states it would negatively affect the industry if one theme became popular for everyone to jump on, and thinks it's more important for game designers to prioritize unique ideas over creating similar projects. He believes it's important for Nintendo to create unique games the competition isn't. If cel shading had become the trend instead, he says they may have instead changed towards realism. While he was surprised by the game's art style upon seeing it, he was outright startled by the reception to it. Aonuma says the team's desire to make a completely new Zelda game never hesitated, and though they noticed the negative reception upon the Wind Waker's announcement, continuing development timidly would have been the worst outcome, so they plunged ahead, determined to go all out and hope to gain acceptance. The planning staff and character production team played well off of each other, led by graphic designer Yoshiki Haruhana. After Ocarina of Time, he proposed numerous eccentric characters, but for the Wind Waker specifically, its world and visual style empowered him to let loose with eccentricity. Suddenly, it was easy to make greatly misshapen body proportions using the stylized look that often added to the character's expressiveness. Eyes became large, facial expressions numerous, particularly between the eyes and mouth. At some point, they even talked about giving characters eye beams. Moving from cartridges to discs also allowed the team to give characters new animations and AI. Characters in the Wind Waker would utilize AI independent of one another and perform numerous animations that Miyamoto claims to bring them to life far more than in previous entries. Link's face also became larger and more expressive. Miyamoto mentions an example of this, where you can see the silly look that Link gives when pressed against a wall looking around. He says these kinds of details add character and is simultaneously funny. One important factor for showing Link's expressions would be his eyes, and programming eye movement. The team experimented by naturally putting items in the world to attract his attention. Having Link stare at objects would achieve both, make his character feel more alive, and help the player notice key objectives. Alongside this, Link would gaze around looking in various directions upon stopping. Aonuma states that his rich expressions give the impression that he's looking at something even when the player's not aware of it. He says there are things Link does outside of the player's agency that brings out a sense of reality for greater immersion. This expression also originally extended to his eye color as well, where they initially made his eyes turn bright red upon entering combat, but ultimately decided to drop this as the people who noticed it found it strange. With music playing a key role into the game's atmosphere, the Wind Waker would slightly differ in some ways from previous entries that adds to both the world and a sense of character during combat. The sound team was much larger than previous titles, partly due to the rushed development schedule and also because they wanted very high-quality sound. Miyamoto wanted the music to more greatly draw emotions from the player to the point where they would want to dance if they heard music that fit a particular mood. The team put in many different instruments to achieve this, and the game even ended up having Celtic influences. This time around, the music didn't just take its usual place irrespective of the player's actions. Instead, the audio team's goal for the Wind Waker's music would be to give it interactivity expressed in combat. A musical sound that matches the chord progression of the background music would play upon hitting enemies. To implement this, the team had to make a complicated program that would process the sound effects into being played at certain notes corresponding with the background music. When Aonuma participated in Ocarina of Time's development, Miyamoto told him it was important to feel the texture of the sound in the game's audio. From there, Aonuma would start checking sound effects to ensure realism, and for the Wind Waker, he thought it was especially important to give it a sense of reality through audio, due to its manga-like art. Some of these sounds would be creatively invented, where one would be made from someone going into the woods and recording an iron pipe hitting a tree. Another would be for walking on a sandy beach that was made by rustling potato chips in its bag. While debugging the game towards wrapping up development, they removed the music completely and had trouble putting it back in. The team needed to spend through a full day trying to solve this, and Aonuma says the entire day felt like they would never be able to do so. They got it working the next day. Everything was back on track, but he describes this as a dark cloud that just blew away. Developing the Wind Waker contained various struggles with some ideas unfulfilled. Despite this, it seemed to be satisfactory overall for the team in terms of quality and progress. Still, with many negative sentiments regarding the game's art style, releasing the game had to be stressful, especially given how long its development would take. Only time would tell if the team's efforts would pay off. Prior to the Wind Waker, Miyamoto would wonder whether players would desire cooperative play in Zelda despite its renown as a single-player franchise. During the Wind Waker's development, Aonuma, possibly influenced by his new role as a father, also thought to add a feature which would allow fathers and their children to play with one another. Understanding GameCube's connectivity with the Game Boy Advance as a possibility, he started a project after the main story progressed far enough. This was kept in mind so considerably at first that it was initially to be a main focus of the game. Wishing players could enjoy the game even without the handheld console, however, he settled on making this feature but with an abated role. Tingle, whose name is based off of one of the designer's friends' names, would be central for this new feature. He was well liked by the team and became a top pick to include in the Wind Waker, despite originally being solely created for Majora's Mask. This was because Aonuma wanted to play with maps on the GBA from the beginning, and he says, when you think of maps, you think of Tingle. Tingle's role would expand in-game, and limited cooperative activity would be accessible if you used a Game Boy Advance to play alongside the main player. This connectivity would be revealed in May 2002. Despite a new cooperative feature revealed, fans were still wary of the game due to its art style. Miyamoto says graphics are the first thing people speak of upon first seeing a game. He hoped players would better understand the game's art style when finally playing it, as he was sure they would get sucked into its story and gameplay. Despite its aesthetic, he thinks players will look around the world and find it realistic in its own right. Expanding, he states that even with realistic graphics, minor details like bumping into things or getting hurt will be out of place if not expressed well. In this regard, he believes the Wind Waker to have a very realistic expression, where they wanted to create a game where everything in the world feels like it's in its place. As another note he puts out there, one neat feature of the Wind Waker is when the player plays it, they get a feeling that it's played out in 3 acts, similar to a play. Miyamoto would be reluctant to show the game off until players got to play it at E3, as he feared discussion would once again focus on the graphics rather than the game itself. When showed off at E3, Link's sailboat only appeared in a minigame, and interviewers thought that would be the sailboat's only appearance. Despite Miyamoto's previous desire to clearly show off the gameplay, he would hit a snag demoing the game. He attempted to show off a new mechanic where you can throw enemies' weapons to destroy blockades, but during this demo he lost track of an enemy's sword and the demo had to be cut short.
See, so if I had the bigger sword, I'd be able to break through that. Looks like it didn't go quite as well as I planned, but that's
The Wind Waker would release in Japan in December 2002 and March 24, 2003 for North America, and Miyamoto would make a statement saying 2.5 years is good pace for completing a Zelda title. Despite Majora's Mask's short development period of about a year, this comment is likely made in reference to The Wind Waker being created utilizing new technology from the ground up, with new systems in its graphical change and the open sea being the game's world. It was still unclear until release, however, whether these new systems would be lauded, ignored, or rejected until after players and reviewers actually played The Wind Waker. Rather than making a game that feels like a game, Aonuma instead wishes to be left with a different kind of feeling. He envisions his games to be a fun experience for the player without necessarily being tied down to what it is in a technical sense, a game or a piece of entertainment. To him, anything could be called Zelda so long as you know how to make it work, despite including strange or foreign concepts to the franchise. This sensation of creating a fun experience over just making a game seems to be his goal for Zelda. More immediately upon launch, Aonuma couldn't directly see the online response to The Wind Waker, and was under the impression they hadn't gotten across the game's artistic style to players that would convince them they had delivered the Zelda game they wanted. The Wind Waker would more immediately be seen for its unique elements that separate it from other Zelda titles. Its art style still put many off from playing the game, but of the people who did try it, The Wind Waker would impress. Publications would consistently review and rate the game as top tier, commonly giving The Wind Waker 9s and 10s. Critics praised nearly every aspect of the game, including its graphics, despite its contentious nature. Animations, environments and details, expressions, controlling Link during fluid combat, its puzzles, and additions made to the franchise since Ocarina of Time. All of these would receive near unanimous praise. Despite its acclaim, however, a couple of common criticisms would arise. These primarily centered around its overall slower pace, which certain quests later in the game appeared to contribute to. Some would also note the game's easier difficulty to be an issue as well. Still, it seemed that The Wind Waker managed to deliver on a satisfying open-sea journey for players who weren't dissuaded by the game's art style. Despite the finished game being well received with plenty of content, however, there's a lot of content that would be cut from the game for largely unknown reasons. If we assumed these restrictions for defining an unused room, for example, there are 29 more unused rooms than there are actual islands in the game. There would be 2 stages that included dungeons, cut so the game would be completed in time. There's also a test map with a variety of objects likely used to test movement and is recycled from Super Mario Sunshine, whether due to it originally being from a different game or not. Interestingly, the water is transparent here, unlike the opaque water found in The Wind Waker. There are also 3 sail names found. One is the normal sail that we likely have in-game. The other 2 are called Zora and Tinkle sails respectively, Tinkle being an internal codename for Tingle. While it's unknown how these sails would have been used, it seems likely the Zora sail would have been used to sail faster. Finally, concept art depicts a fisherman pulling Link from the water to warp elsewhere. Did you know Gaming claims that Aonuma spoke of this in interviews, saying they originally had plans for 2 different worlds entirely akin to A Link to the Past, but couldn't enact it due to time constraints. Despite its toon art style controversies and the game found with all kinds of content cut for various reasons, The Wind Waker would ultimately be greeted with acclaim around the world. Its sales wouldn't be the best the franchise has, and there were still many fans unwilling to touch the game for one very clear reason. But those who did found a massive breadth of content that still made it worthy of being called Zelda. More immediately, The Wind Waker would top 560,000 pre-orders, and while it would sell up to 1 million copies in 2003, Aonuma says the game didn't fare well in Japan. He attributes this to its cell shading and something he calls gamer drift, whereby the Japanese market moves away from games. The solution for the latter would be to make the Nintendo DS to target those who haven't played games before. This console would end up selling over 150 million units, and is the best-selling handheld console to date. The Wind Waker would sell an intriguing amount of copies given the game's circumstances. Part of this has to do with the console sales. Though GameCube ended up selling similarly to Xbox, PlayStation 2 was far ahead in sales. While The Wind Waker initially sold about 2.2 million copies, it ended up selling about twice that, becoming the fourth best-selling GameCube game. Despite an impressive sales count, however, these are speculated to be higher than otherwise due to pre-order incentives where players could attain Ocarina of Time and Master's Quest for no additional cost. Still, considering GameCube as a console sold noticeably less than its predecessor, though Wind Waker's sales would still be considered high by some, though with the caveat that its sales would be attributed to the pre-order bonus. Others considered sales low, particularly when compared with Ocarina of Time's 7.6 million units sold by 2004. The Wind Waker would still sell better than Majora's Mask's 3.3 million, but it should be noted that Majora's Mask had a far shorter development cycle using its predecessor's engine and reused much technology. After The Wind Waker, Aonuma heard people's feedback and carried it into subsequent games. Though Tingle would integrate into The Wind Waker for being well-liked, his role in the franchise would be sparse. He wouldn't appear much afterwards due to being commonly disliked in the West. For the next home console titles, A Wind Waker 2 would be titled at GDC 2004. While concepts for The Wind Waker 2 did exist, it's uncertain how long this was actually seriously considered. Aonuma stated the team would focus on The Wind Waker 2 and improved the eye-tracking system introduced in the first game. It would have taken place on land instead of sea. However, the team wanted Link to ride on horseback, but this came across difficulties with Toon Link and his proportions. Making an adult Toon Link didn't seem appropriate to them either. They ultimately changed concepts to eventually create Twilight Princess, since demand for a realistic Zelda continued anyway. For media in relation to The Wind Waker, many characters would appear in a game mode for Japanese and Korean versions of Four Swords Adventures. A Game Boy Advance Wind Waker demo would be proposed by a couple Ubisoft employees, and one of the pixel art concepts was shared in 2017. It's difficult to discern how far into concept or development stages this went. 2 direct sequels to The Wind Waker would release for Nintendo DS in 2007 and 2009. Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks respectively. Though The Wind Waker received acclamation upon release, many expressed hesitation to playing the game in the first place as a consequence of a multitude of factors. The industry trending towards realism during the generation, Nintendo showcasing a realistic Zelda demo the year prior that set expectations, and only released on a console that didn't perform as well as its predecessor. Despite players' hesitancy towards the game, likely few would have predicted a sudden resurgence in popularity for the game over 10 years later.
And The Wind Waker.
The team wanted inspiration for developing a Zelda game on Wii U, so they tinkered with previous games on the console to see what they could do. The Wind Waker's Link made a particularly strong impression on them, so they decided to start making a full HD remake for it on Wii U. The team was also able to finish the project in under a year, which would help greenlight development too. With only 3 main designers, this team devised a way to convert GameCube data for Wii U, which would make the visuals look better without much need for them to work on the 3D modeling. Unlike his role as a director before, Aonuma would produce The Wind Waker HD and had clear goals in mind, fix issues, and improve the game. To this end, one of the art designers for the original release would more or less reprise his role for HD. His art was initially interpreted to craft the game's world, but for HD, the original's game data was taken to try to make it work on this newer version. After The Wind Waker HD was announced, fans became eager to see whether the team would reinstate the 2 cut dungeons mentioned earlier. Aonuma, aware of this fervor, responded by saying they had used those dungeons for other titles. While not used in their original format, it seems elements of them found their way into dungeons for titles after The Wind Waker, though specifically which ones, Aonuma never specified. He expands by saying if the game had too few dungeons, this would have been due to poor pacing, and claims those issues would be alleviated in the remake. This was helped by a late-game quest being easier to execute, and the inclusion of a sail that doubles the speed of the sailboat. Another inclusion was a harder difficulty mode called Hero Mode, which completely omits the ability to drop small hearts. Aonuma says that since it's a remake, he wanted to give something extra for those who had previously experienced the original. To the team, it was essential to create something better than what the players remember, yet still manages to retain the original's atmosphere. Upon reflection, the team thought they had made The Wind Waker too early, as they thought its graphical art style was limited by GameCube's technology. One example of this was the importance of 16:9 displays, and how the ocean looks in this aspect ratio. Aonuma thought the original version they tried to make was beyond what the GameCube was capable of expressing, and this became apparent upon seeing it on Wii U. Despite the game's art style being perceived as unrealistic, one employee emphasizes the idea of reality over realism, where they would express actions that don't come across by simply portraying photorealistic graphics. Instead, the creative and fitting expression of elements like wind or sunlight are what contribute to having something akin to a sense of temperature or smell in a game's world. Aonuma mentions that what they wanted to show and what they could display were in conflict for the original, and states what the team envisioned for the game became a reality for the remake. In retrospect, Aonuma thought the fanbase split into two groups upon The Wind Waker's release. One happy about the game, and the other reluctant to try it, saying it's for kids. Despite this, it seems negative opinions for the game waned over time. The HD release seemed to have far more positive sentiments across the board, releasing when realistic graphics were more commonplace. Maybe it's this industry shift that allowed The Wind Waker HD to attain more consistently positive reception as realistic graphics no longer superseded innovative games. Across numerous interviews, a through line becomes clear for the Zelda team. They desire to refine games by recreating components traditionally, but drastically altering course elsewhere. In Aonuma's words, you can have a sense of games being copies of previous titles, and if we do this, the games begin to lack uniqueness. This is why coming up with unique ideas alongside already set concepts is very important. He often expresses concerns in balancing new with the old, and thinks if he keeps doing remakes he wouldn't grow, but if they changed too much, Zelda would stop being Zelda at some point. Despite his concerns and The Wind Waker likely becoming the most unique home console title up to that point, it seems the team never doubted whether it was truly Zelda or not. Miyamoto states when he was younger, he enjoyed hiking and mountain climbing. He once found a large lake near the top of one mountain he climbed. He was amazed, and reflecting on this experience is what helped him create the grand outdoor adventure, The Legend of Zelda. Maybe it's the concept of having an adventure that inspired him, or maybe it was the freedom he felt from these experiences. Maybe it was immersing oneself in a joyful experience. Adventuring in real life, it's dangerous to go alone, but for The Wind Waker, it doesn't take too much to become immersed. Whether it's through complexity of the vast ocean sea, or is as simple as the wind feeling as though it's blowing better, one can rest assured that this Zelda title's atmosphere went where it counted most. While Zelda certainly expresses many adventurous tenets in its games, I think one would have good reason to say that The Wind Waker would have been the franchise's pinnacle for immersion at the time. While it may have never received the sales or appreciation that some other Zelda titles have, The Wind Waker still crafted a unique and compelling experience for many, and would go down as one of gaming's greatest examples of a realistic game under the guise of an unrealistic art style. With Zelda's recent games utilizing mechanics stemming from The Wind Waker, it's also probably safe to say that it's still inspiring creators even today. Much of these praised elements are in no small part thanks to The Wind Waker's success in those same areas 20 years ago. If you've enjoyed this, you may appreciate my other documentaries. You can also join my Discord server if you'd like to chat. If you'd like to support my work, Patreon contributions will encourage me to make more, and I would personally love to thank you for donating in future outros. You'll also gain access to facts and opinions not shared in these videos as well as early previews. Thanks for watching. The Legend of Zelda's seen all kinds of different themes, stories, gameplay offerings, and atmospheric draws when accounting for the numerous entries across the decades. It's always pushed the industry further with its massive worlds, ambitious quests, and engrossing settings. Whether you're new to the franchise or not, once you've fully played a Zelda game, it's difficult to be anything but enamored with its world. While some were turned off from The Wind Waker's cel-shaded graphics, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker will always be a fan favorite to others.